Vietnam. So for me, it's about 8 p.m. now. And it's my honor and privilege to be speaking to you now about something very, very interesting, which is a new framework that the World Bank and UNESCO came up with about using culture, making culture the heart of city reconstruction and recovery. I think many of you have been in a situation where, unfortunately, a crisis happen. And here, when we say crisis happen in a city or in a country, we refer to like post-disaster, hurricane, storm, any nature-based disaster, or it could be post-conflict, war, ethnic issue, and it can be crises like civil unrest or war on drugs or revolution, that all these aspects leave the people traumatized and leave the space destroyed or distracted. So this framework trying to address how to give guiding principles, operational guiding principles to city and policymakers on how to reconstruct and how to engage in a recovery process, but keeping the people in the heart of the reconstruction and recovery process. And it is called Culture in City Reconstruction and Recovery. So we use the CU from culture and RE and reconstruction, and we call it CURE framework. So that's just to add to the several frameworks we have all been using for city reconstruction and recovery. In my presentation today, I will devote 15 minutes or 20 minutes to presentation, and leaving the last 10 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have any question, please just type it on the chat, and my colleagues will filter and will send it to me. I will present today the introduction of why we are doing this work, what's its objective and the context. Then I will move to the approach we have taken to prepare this framework, and it's now a position paper published by UNESCO and World Bank. If you can just type CURE, World Bank UNESCO, it will take you to the hard copy of it and all media coverage made in social media about it, short videos. Then I'll present the CURE framework itself, its key principles, and how then to implement such a framework, and some concluding remarks. I think we all agree that when disaster happens, the most affected are actually the people, the human part of it, because they lost their houses, they lost their iconic cultural assets, whether it's a temple, church, mosque, pagoda, and so on. And they lost their infrastructure and economic livelihood. So it is the multitude of losses that make people very traumatized. Several efforts happens by different cities and countries and donor and international organizations to come and reconstruct quickly. But we forget in such reconstruction process what really matters. We, human, people, the residents, the owners of this space and place, how can they have a voice? How can they be the center actually of the reconstruction process? So how can we make it reverse engineering process into placing the culture as the foundation upon which cities are built, and the culture is in the heart of the reconstruction and recovery process. So the objective of this position paper is to build on a shared conviction that culture is critical to achieve sustainable urban development and to ensure effective post-crisis reconstruction and recovery. It's based on this conviction of all of us. So the world, a top of experts of the World Bank and UNESCO came up a couple of years ago to elaborate this position paper, and with the purpose to enhance culture-based frameworks for city reconstruction and recovery. And we built on UNESCO's previous work on what we call the 3P, the people-centered, place-based policies and approaches, the 3P. So some of the context, I think we all realize that the world is urbanized, has urbanized and is urbanizing fast. It's 77% of global population lives now in cities. These figures will reach in a decade or two to 70%. But also we witness increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, affecting about 200 million people every year with displacement or losses, different kinds of losses. But also, unfortunately, armed conflicts are still happening, and no matter what peace process we're trying to do, every year we see conflict happens between neighboring countries or two countries or within the country, and affects about 69 million people are displaced now, of which 19.9 million are refugees. And that's not adding what happened this year in many countries. So we call this, crisis, post-crisis. Also crisis, again, we refer to post-disaster, post-conflict, and post-distress, if you like. Distress if urban revolution, civil unrest, social war on drugs or something. So we call it distress happening in the urban space. So after such distress or disasters happen, how can we reconstruct, how can we start the reconstruction process and the recovery process, placing people in the heart of our policy making and the place of cultural identity in the heart of the reconstruction process. That's what we refer to as culture. We see uppercase capital culture here, so the broader sense of culture. The approach we took to prepare this position paper and framework, three aspects. We commissioned three major background papers. One looked at the past frameworks. I think many of you used many of the frameworks before, different ones. So they reviewed all of them and checked to which extent culture has been embedded on them, either in design or in practice when they are implemented. And I will come back to this later. Then it reviewed specifically the peace building aspects, so the post-conflict, how sustainable recovery happens in peace building and recovery process. And then we looked at Europe, particular cases of reconstruction and recovery, because I think we know since the Second World War, the damage happened in Europe post-war have been huge, and many countries had good or less good experience with reconstruction and recovery. So a lot of lessons learned from Europe. Then we had case studies. We had 6 in-depth case studies. These are from Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, Japan, Bosnia, and Hiroshima, Timbuktu, Mali, Beirut, Lebanon, and Medellin, Colombia. Then we looked at several other cases, but we put in boxes throughout the position paper, like Banda Aceh in Indonesia, Nicosia in Cyprus, Philippines, Christchurch in New Zealand, Bagan in Myanmar, Kathmandu in Nepal, and Liaojin in China. We had also several Liang in China. And then we had several consultation and dissemination events in Paris, in UNESCO office, in Kuala Lumpur during the World Urban Forum, the previous one, not the last one in Abu Dhabi. We had expert peer reviewers. We had launching in UNESCO, launching in World Bank, consultation and dissemination with ICROM, and during the WRC4. So it's just a snapshot of our case studies. The key feature of it, and you can find online the detailed case study of each one. I mean, in Seoul, the most important thing we learned is how to leverage cultural tourism to boost local development. Seoul did not get it immediately right. They went through different iterations of reconstruction, from social buildings to regeneration into cultural heritage, regeneration of all the towns, how to deal with issues of gentrification, but more as they went through the process over the decades, they perfected the community consultation, and they are still trying to, to enhance community consultation in the process. But it was a citywide approach, which was very, very good. Tokyo similarly took a citywide approach through a master plan and adapted innovative measures during to finance such reconstruction and recovery through land value captures and land readjustment mechanisms to finance the reconstruction. Again, have been very good consultation throughout the process. In Sarajevo, I think we all know the case of Mostar Bridge, and the way also the consultation took very good place, and they used it as iconic center of the reconstruction of the whole city and promoting multidisciplinary approach to recovery and planning, as well as dealing with people's trauma that happened post-war and post-losses of many cultural heritage assets. In Timbuktu, there have been also a very, very good case of seriously engaging the communities in the process of restoration of their own heritage, which gives them the sense of pride and ownership, and that fosters a social cohesion and the reconciliation process among the communities. In Beirut, Lebanon, has been a very interesting model also in public-private in the financing through public-private partnerships, and the need for balanced approach between the reconstruction, bringing private sector, but also community consultation and constructing something that people like and can afford. So there have been several iteration of the reconstruction, especially in the solidaire model. In Median, which is a case of post-crisis or post-city distress after the war on crime, how they build what you call the citizen culture to address the urban distress after the end of the war on crime. So some of the findings of the background papers about is the evolution of frameworks. And I think many of you use different parts of these frameworks because they're all good, but it is actually the natural evolution of these frameworks and how we become now more explicit in embedding culture at the heart of the reconstruction process. People in the heart of the reconstruction and recovery process. So it started from the Yokohama strategy in 1994, which focused on disaster prevention and preparedness, mitigation and relief, to Hyogo framework in 2005-2015, which in fact recognized cultural diversity as an essential element for effective planning and reconstruction, to Sendai framework, which I think many of us use it now and still very valid, and which guides disaster risk reduction related interventions of the international community. Many of us have done PDNA, post-disaster needs assessment, or RPBA, recovery and peace building assessment. So PDNA for post-disaster and RPBA for post-conflict. It's very similar, and it's engage everyone, partners, multi-donor, bilaterals, into coming to an action plan. But we also know that sometimes it's very quick and heavy process, takes longer time, and it needs a good team to put people in the heart of these rapid assessments. And then we have the UNESCO recommendations on historic urban landscape, which actually have culture in the heart of it. So what changes in the existing framework and what the value addition of this framework we are proposing now? Existing frameworks, you know, it's, as I said, it's a bit, sometimes it's heavy engineering process because you want to reconstruct quickly. So the reconstruction and recovery may not always be aligned, and put pressures on urgency. So you want to reconstruct quickly. So some aspects of poverty analysis, vulnerability, under cultural aspects, the trauma and reconciliation needs of people are not very well considered. Where our framework, CURE framework, put culture as a driver and enabler of post-crisis and city reconstruction and recovery, and it's in the heart of the overall integrated process, looking at place-based approaches, people-centered approaches, and policies and governance. So that's the 3P. place, people, and policies. Now coming to the framework to present it, as you see, culture is in the heart of the reconstruction process. It looks at the integrated cultural and creative industries and intangible heritage also. It considers the norms and traditions of communities and their perception of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. On top of it, you see the people-centered policies, and in the bottom, you see the place-based policies, and how these 3P inform both the physical reconstruction, whether it's reconstruction of infrastructure, of housing, buildings, and tangible cultural heritage of damage happened to some tangible cultural heritage, and then the socioeconomic recovery on the left, which looks at people's socioeconomic aspects of livelihood, creativity, and social and economic structures. So when linking all of this with culture in the middle, you get recommendations, or you got the process right about community ownership to reflect the societal priorities, to operate in a sustainable way, to develop infrastructure, housing, and facilities that are linked to people's culture and identity and priorities, most importantly. But their priorities, they should set the priorities right. Do you want to start reconstruction of water system or schools, hospitals, or religious centers? We have to consult them in their priorities so that they take ownership of the reconstruction process. And always allows also to understand when you link the place-based policies like all the towns, souk, and other public space into the socioeconomic recovery, you would understand, the people's values and norms and traditions and priorities for critical socioeconomic recovery process. 7 principles came out of our huge research. I'm summarizing actually a year-long work and so many case studies and huge number of experts working on this. The first principle is culture construct. So acknowledge the city as a cultural construct where built structures are open spaces and closely linked to the social fabric. The second principle is the reconciliation process. If we put people in the heart, we should understand their distress, their frustration, their trauma, and how can we reconcile them through the process. And I think Indonesia has been a very good case in this reconciliation process, not only among the community, but ending years of isolation or between the local community or the local district, province, and central government. Fostering cultural expressions that offers appropriate ways to deal with post-crisis trauma and reconciliation. Prioritize culture in the planning process. So any new land use would look at tangible cultural heritage, will look at areas where intangible cultural heritage, culture and creative industries are produced, and perhaps give priority for them, both for reconstruction or conservation, as well as to use the culture and creative industries as means for socioeconomic recovery. Engaging communities upfront, not in a fictitious way or placation, how to consult the communities throughout the process, and then look at the financing models. There are so many different models of financing. We always either wait for central government to finance or wait for donor agencies or international financial institutions to finance, but there are so many other modalities for that I can talk about if you wish later. And then effective management of the reconstruction process. In so many places we see very good plans, but then stop short of financing models or stop short of implementation, or implementation take forever. So how can we build institutions that can do the reconstruction process like FEMA in the States or in Japan and other places? We go through 4 phases. Phase 1 is the damage and needs assessment and scoping of what we want to do. Then we set policies and strategies. We identify financial models or modalities, and it should be a menu of options. And then we move into implementation with the aspects I mentioned. Implementing the CURE framework should be flexible and iterative process. It requires detailed knowledge of the interventions context and should be adapted to the socioeconomic specifics of each city. It should encompass the entire city. Even a damage happen in one part of the city, we need to look at citywide approach, especially for historic areas, and reflect the need to provide rapid response to emergencies. So while it's a long process, we look at the whole city. But if we see a temple damaged or school or a religious center or hospital, I mean, we can spend 2 years planning to come up with a conclusion that we should start by reconstructing these aspects. Give people water, give people access roads, give people the major human development aspects. So we need to identify this, what we can call quick wins, that people have high priority for people, and then other issues, other priority, capital investment priorities. And to conclude, just to say 3 messages takeaway: culture plays a key role in post-crisis reconstruction and recovery. We showed how people should be in the center of it and the advantage of doing that for ownership and sustainability. Culture should be acknowledged as a foundation that integrates people-centered and place-based policies, and to produce effective city reconstruction and recovery programs. Mainstreaming culture across the damage and needs assessment, scoping, planning, financing, and implementation stages is very essential. So thank you very much for listening. I will stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Okay, I see first question came from the audience. It asks about what are the current global frameworks and tools for reconstruction and recovery? That's a very good question. I think there have been evolution of different frameworks over the past, since 1994, from the Yokohama strategy that I think laid very good framework for disaster preventions and preparedness, to Hugo framework, which many people used as essential element for effective planning and reconstruction. And many of you then, use the concept of build back better, or the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which came in 2015. But the most common frameworks or tools we use are the PDNA for disaster risk, for disaster response needs assessment, and the RPBA for post-conflict. And now this framework is trying to come building on all of that and place culture at the heart of this process. Another question is just came from the audience. I can read. What are the shortcomings of existing reconstruction and recovery frameworks? So I wouldn't say shortcomings, because I think that was the evolution of our global knowledge as both practitioners, city officials, and national policymakers. So we learn from history, we learn from frameworks, and but what I would, if you insist to use the word shortcomings, I would say that culture has not all the time been explicitly considered at the heart of the reconstruction and recovery process. And even if we say that we will consider cultural aspects, we find that consultation is not taking place properly at the community level, no kind of stakeholders analysis, and no proper voicing of different segments of the community. So respecting all identities and voicing their voice in the process is very important. Another question came about financing modalities. So what financing modalities are used in the reconstruction and recovery? That's a very good question because as I said, we always rely to the center. We look at the center. Local budget is very constrained for Ministry of Finance to finance a reconstruction, which is good. It should be because each Ministry of Finance has emergency budget and they can. But then we have an array of other modalities. The most important I would like to bring to your attention is land value captures and public-private partnership. So we have different models of using your land. If you do a quick land use plan or a new master plan, you find that you find some parcels of land that can be earmarked and maybe swapped with the private sector for private sector to finance some reconstruction effort. So we gave you this 1,000 square meter of prime land that have been demolished, and we can keep it, and in return, you reconstruct these houses or school or hospital or so on. We also have the concept of land zoning, upzoning, and different aspects of public-private partnership where we may bring a private sector to construct something and say, okay, we will have a concessional agreement with you, you will operate and maintain, and you will collect the fees coming from it later. And then our last question, what matrices are used within the framework? So the framework, as I said, it builds on these 3 Ps. And there's a lot of matrices involved in the 3 Ps. During time constraint, perhaps I would suggest to you to have a look at the position paper and then look at also the report of UNESCO of the 3P. It has a lot of information related to your question. So I think it's about 8:30 now, 8:29. I don't see any other question coming. So by this, I would like to say thank you. It has been a pleasure talking to you today. I hope you found this framework useful and you apply it in your, God forbid, you apply it in your reconstruction and recovery process. But I don't need to say that it's a framework applied even for regular urban regeneration schemes, or if you want to put a plan for culture and creative industries to foster them. So people-centered approach applies for every aspect.